Hello and welcome to this installment of Vox Machina. As your narrator, I'll be bringing fantastic works of fiction from the page to your eardrums. Uploads will be posted weekly, so be sure to subscribe and hit the alerts bell to be notified when new installments are available. Got a story you think deserves the Vox Machina treatment? Let me know in a comment and you might just hear it in a future episode. Thanks for listening and on with the show. Every New Beginning by Fencer X. Episode 21. He avoided Draco for several weeks, which was actually quite easy, as Draco was avoiding him as well. Harry did not visit the room, and Draco stopped coming to DA meetings. They did not meet eyes over meals, and Harry did not ask after him from the mutual friends who shared classes with him. Parkinson, he thought, was giving him the stink eye, but then she had always looked at him like he was covered in bubotuber pus, so it was difficult to tell if there was any particular reason behind her sour looks. The one time he'd remarked ever so casually to Zabini that Draco wasn't in attendance at a DA meeting, Zabini had merely shrugged, going through the motions of his bedazzling hex, and said, "He'll come around once he's finished his tantrum. Chin up there, Saviour, and show me how my form's wrong." Had this actually been his 8th year, Harry might have found it easy to distract himself with all the sorts of activities he would have been putting off in favour of spending time with Draco. Quidditch and Hogsmeade weekends, and avoiding preparing for his own newts. But such efforts were now dogged by a dull, throbbing pain that was a constant backdrop to everything he did, like a rotting tooth. Guilt and confusion and frustration with both himself and, inexplicably, Draco ate away at him like an insidious case of wasting disease. Hermione must have surmised from Harry's quiet demeanour and the fact he wasn't cloistered in the room at all hours now that his talk with Draco had not gone quite as well as he might have hoped, for she did not pester him any further about his contributions to their research efforts or with whom and how he chose to spend his time. In fact, she didn't speak to him much at all, though Ron at least was no longer avoiding him like the plague, and Harry forgot, very much by accident, that she'd been wanting him to come clean to McGonagall about who he was and when he was from, so she could speak to the authorities about getting him sorted. Forgot until he wasn't given much choice in the matter. It was a dreary, overcast Saturday morning when Harry was awoken by someone very softly and very squeakily calling his name. He willed his eyes to open, and after a few tries they finally complied, sticky with sleep and refusing to bring the world into focus until Harry remembered he still needed glasses these days. "Oh, very good, Mr. Harry Potter, sir. You is awake." For certain definitions of awake, Harry supposed, he groped for his glasses, which were promptly pressed into his hand. "What time is it?" he asked, still not sure to whom he was speaking. Then he slid his glasses on and saw. "Oh." The house elf beamed up at him from beside his bed, the bat-like ears trembling with delight. "Good morning, Mr. Harry Potter, sir. The hour is now being 7 o'clock. 7. He never took breakfast on Saturday precisely because it was worth more to him to sleep in as late as he pleased than to have a full belly. If he slept till lunchtime, then he'd get his fill regardless, wouldn't he? "And why are you in my dorm room at 7 o'clock on a Saturday? Dropsy, sir." Now that's an unfortunate name." He wiped a hand over his face. "What can I do for you, Dropsy?" The elf held up a silver platter, atop which sat a card bearing his initials. He reached for it, pushing his glasses up and squinting at the loopy script, and mouthed the text to himself as he read. His presence was requested at his very earliest convenience, underlined twice so that he understood this to mean immediately, in the headmistress's office. He was to come alone, he was to come directly, and he was not to tell anyone where he was going or why. Harry's gaze slid back to Dropsy. He waved the card. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" "Oh, Dropsy wouldn't be knowing anything about that. Here, Mr. Harry Potter." Dropsy snapped his fingers, and a plate piled high with a sumptuous sampling of breakfast goodies appeared upon the silver platter. "A quick bite, and then you'll need to be off. The password is Paisley Earmuffs." Dropsy set the plate on Harry's bedside table and then disappeared with a crack, back into the bowels of the castle to do whatever it was house elves busied themselves doing all the livelong day. Harry sighed and decided that whatever he was about to be yelled at for, it was better to be yelled at on a full stomach. After inhaling his breakfast and casting a hasty freshening charm, if McGonagall wanted him showered and primped, she ought to have sent drops here around noon, Harry pulled on his most comfortable t-shirt and jeans, slipped his wand into his pocket, and began to make his way groggily to the 3rd floor. McGonagall would frown at him being out of uniform when he presented himself to her, but it was the weekend, and she was probably going to frown at him regardless, so he didn't think it much mattered what he wore. He muttered the password to the gargoyle guarding the staircase entrance leading up to the headmistress's office, and plodded slowly up the winding steps. As he went, though, he thought he could hear voices. McGonagall, of course, but others as well. Was she speaking to her portraits? He hadn't seen some of the old headmaster's portraits in years. Dumbledore's he'd spotted at Christmas, but he would have liked to have paid his respects to Professor Black, and he might have even liked to see Snape's ugly mug sneering down at him. Early mornings made him feel funny. But when he mounted the landing and poked his head into the office proper, knocking politely on the jamb, he was disappointed to find it was not her portraits to whom McGonagall had been speaking. It was Hermione and Ron, and a third party whose identity Harry did not know, but whose occupation he very much did. An unspeakable. There was no mistaking those long, formless black robes and the odd glamour all unspeakables wore that distorted their facial features beyond recognition. "Oh, good," Hermione sighed with relief. "You're here." She glanced at the clocks lining the wall behind McGonagall's desk. "We were about to send Ron back after you." Ron sat in the corner with a plate of what looked like the same breakfast Harry himself had just wolfed down, gave an enthusiastic nod, and then spoke around a mouthful. "And this breakfast." "Manners, Mr. Weasley," McGonagall grit out. She sat straight and stiff behind her grand desk, fingers laced and lips pursed, lemon-sucking tight. "We've a guest." Ron ducked his head, and McGonagall fixed Harry with a cool, knowing gaze as she shifted to her feet and brushed down her robes. "Good morning, Mr. Potter." Or perhaps I should say Aura Potter." Harry stiffened, glancing to Hermione in panic. "You told?" Hermione's lips pursed in a perfect imitation of McGonagall's. "Well, you weren't telling." "I was," Harry protested. "I was going to." He then looked at Ron. "You let her?" Ron swallowed with some difficulty, patting at his lips with a napkin he'd draped over one knee. "You think there's any letting when she's on a mission, mate?" "And a good thing Miss Granger did tell me, as I can't imagine what's delayed you in seeking help outside of your friends." McGonagall gave Hermione a bland smile. "Not to disparage your efforts, Miss Granger, but something of this magnitude, manipulating the very fabric of space-time, well, I would have thought I might at least be one of your first stops." Harry's brows knit in confusion. She didn't know why he'd put off coming to her. That meant Hermione hadn't confessed to just how much mucking about with the timeline he'd done. How he'd come back to try and give Draco a chance to redeem himself and avoid the kiss. Why wouldn't she have told them that if she told them everything else? He glanced to Hermione as if expecting to see the answer written on her features, but she was carefully avoiding his gaze, chewing on a nail. McGonagall sighed loudly, then cleared her throat. "Regardless, here we are now. Miss Granger and Mr. Weasley have attempted to explain the situation to me, and while I admit I found the notion just the tiniest bit far-fetched initially, I've had discussions with Hagrid and Professor Grubblyplank, as well as our visitor." She extended an arm to the Unspeakable F, from the Department of Mysteries, who have all assured me that this is indeed possible, and in fact not without precedent. Harry gave a start. "Wait, F?" He stared at the Unspeakable, scrutinizing the whirling, twisting features where the face was meant to be. "You're F?" The Unspeakable regarded him curiously. At least he thought it might be curiously. "Have we had the pleasure, Aura Potter?" The pleasure? No. Harry did not think he would have described their one and only interaction as anything approaching pleasurable. I was assigned to shadow you when I'm from, to retrieve the Ouroboros. Things didn't quite pan out how they were meant to, obviously. He wrinkled his nose. "You weren't very nice to me." "Well, I'm afraid I won't be very nice to you this time either." Oh yes, that was definitely F under all that spell work.
You may want to have a seat.
F pointed her wand at an empty chair which pranced over to park itself right at Harry's feet. He took it, if only because he was still a bit wobbly on his feet first thing in the morning. Ron scooted his chair over to sit beside Harry, clapping his shoulder in moral support as he banished his empty plate back to the kitchens, and Hermione stood at his other side. A tendril of unease began to curl in his gut because it felt like he was being set up to retrieve some rather bracing news.
Aura Potter, I regret to inform you that it is impossible for you to return to your own timeline.
There was a long beat of silence, and Harry supposed this meant they were waiting for his reaction. He blinked, glancing at F, then McGonagall. I don't get it. You mean to say you don't know how to send me back?
If that was what I had meant to say, I would have said it,
F said, a bit tartly.
It isn't that we don't know. It's simply that we know it to be impossible. There is nothing to know.
She waved her wand, casting too quickly and quietly for Harry to follow what she'd done, though the way his ears gave a faint pop and everything went impossibly quiet suggested she'd warded McGonagall's office in some manner to keep out any eavesdroppers.
I cannot speak to how far along my compatriots in the line from whence you came are in their research on the Ouroboros, but we in time, the sub-department, not the abstract concept, mind you, have been studying this creature for quite a long while, and we've made impressive headway into understanding its biology.
You've already got one, Harry marvelled. How? You nearly got me killed trying to get your hands on Matilda. Why would you need another? Hermione pinched his shoulder. Just listen for once.
The time researchers in your line didn't need another,
F answered anyway.
They didn't have one to begin with.
I don't get it, Harry said. You just said you did have one.
You said we did, if we're being precise.
God, Harry had forgotten what a pedant F could be.
And if you'll kindly take Miss Granger's advice and listen, perhaps you'll understand. The Ouroboros is an extremely dangerous creature. Perhaps the most dangerous one we've ever encountered in the magical world. As you've learned, it does have the power to manipulate time, but not in the sense you're thinking.
F twirled her wand slowly, conjuring a long stream of glowing magic that hung like a fishing line in the air between them.
The Ouroboros does not view the world in the same way as humans, a mere 3 spatial dimensions and a temporal 4th. It sees, instead, a vast array of worlds existing all at once, alternate timelines, or more precisely, alternate realities. Indeed, entire alternate universes.
The thread of magic multiplied into a dozen of different lengths and vectors, some overlapping, some diverging, like a tangled web. Harry swallowed, throat dry. The manifold worlds theory. He was certain F was blinking at him in shock, and when she spoke again, her garbled voice had a hitch to it.
Yes, quite right. While our human minds are limited to viewing only the line, the reality, into which we were born, the Ouroboros can see all of them unfolding at the same time.
She gestured to the lines of magic whipping around them, then lowered her wand, and they all winked out.
In other words, for this creature, time is happening all at once. If one is unlucky, or else unwise, enough to get themselves bitten by one, the venom of the Ouroboros will extract the conscience of the victim and inject it not simply into an alternate time, but an alternate space, an alternate reality. One where, for example, circumstances might have led to an Ouroboros specimen being procured years earlier than in the victim's original reality.
She slipped her wand back into her robes.
One where the events perpetrated by the interloper would become part of that line's present and eventually its future. a future entirely separate from the future this interloper hailed from. It is this that makes the creature far more dangerous than a simple time-turner, as in essence an entirely new timeline, an entirely different universe, is created.
All the talk of realities and universes and timelines was starting to make Harry's head hurt, and he latched onto the only familiar element. Wait, a time turner? I don't get it. How is this any different from what a time turner does?
Did you not just hear me?
F sighed, cocking her head to glance at Hermione, who only shrugged as if to say, sorry he's so thick.
Time turners can only operate within a single reality, a single universe. They are a fantastic magical feat, of that there can be no doubt. But they pale in comparison to the abilities of this creature. For one thing, they're misleading in their name. A time-turner does not allow one to turn back time to change it, only to replay it. Our actions in the past have already happened as they did, and that cannot be changed, else they would not have happened as we recall them in the present. Any actions you may believe you took to alter the future while using a time-turner are, in fact, simply part of the fabric of time itself. Fate, if you will. Outcomes foretold, such that while they seem to bring about a certain future, in fact they have no consequence on that future at all.
His headache was starting to sharpen now, and Hermione helped matters none when she interjected, I did read, though, in the June 98 edition of the Timely Times that there are ways a time turner might be manipulated to generate an offshoot, a branch timeline whose future could be altered from the time turner's target point.
Yes, in theory, and R will be delighted to learn you've read their article. But besides being highly illegal, the spellwork required would...
McGonagall cleared her throat loudly, and Harry felt Ron listening drowsily next to him. While I appreciate your enthusiasm on the matter, Unspeakable F, perhaps we could get back to the matter at hand? Hermione seemed to wilt, almost pouting, and Harry found himself silently agreeing with Draco that she really should have considered becoming an Unspeakable. How would that have worked with Ron, though? Were all Unspeakables single, or did they just not tell their partners about their work? Did they have covers? Holy balls, Hermione might actually be an Unspeakable, with her position as the Undersecretary only being a ruse. First, the slow, horrifying realization he wasn't half the aura he was cracked up to be, and now this? His whole world was falling apart. Aura Potter, are you all right? McGonagall said, frowning. You look like you're about to be sick. I'm fine, Professor, Headmistress. He managed a tight smile that McGonagall did not believe, but she let him have his internal breakdown as he pleased. Dropsy's breakfast was sitting queasy in his stomach now, and all he really wanted to do was head back to Gryffindor Tower to catch up on the sleep he was currently being deprived. Listen, guys, I'm sure all this alternate universe, parallel reality stuff is really fascinating to some, but I'm mostly interested in what it's got to do with my supposedly not being able to go back to my proper time. He glanced between Hermione and F, hoping one or both might clarify. I mean, I came here once, why can't I just go back? It's not the same timeline, manifold world, and whatnot, I get that, but can't we just, I don't know, reverse the Ouroboros' magic to send me back where I came from?
Oh, quite easily.
Hermione boggled. Really?
Of course not. My apologies. I forget sometimes that sarcasm doesn't translate well through the vocal modulation charm.
F bobbed her head a bit in a half-shrug.
Although that isn't to suggest that with sufficient funding and research we couldn't manage to replicate the magic, and perhaps develop a counter.
Well, see, then that doesn't mean it's impossible.
Oh no, I'm afraid what you want is still quite impossible. They're sending your consciousness, your soul, some might call it, back to the line to which it belongs, and then they're sending it back to your old body. One is theoretically feasible, the other very much not.
Harry's stomach bottomed out. What do you mean by that? Were the two concepts not the same? When had souls entered the equation? He'd messed about with soul magic before, and he was not keen to do so again.
The Ouroboros is, at its most basic, a venomous snake. Nothing more. It is not the creature itself that is magical so much as its venom.
Harry frowned. There wasn't much he recalled about his brief run-in with Doyle, but Hermione had made him document all he could remember fairly early on. But Doyle, the bloke who was trying to fence the Ouroboros to F and me, he said the snake had to bite someone, that the venom couldn't simply be injected.
Oh, that's only because of the volatile nature of the toxin. Studies have shown that a deglanded Ouroboros is no more deadly than a common garden snake.
Hermione gave a start. Studies? What sort of studies? You let your specimen bite people? But F ignored her this time.
The venom of the Ouroboros works by extracting the consciousness, as I said, the soul, of its victim, severing its connection to its corporeal form in the one line, and then overlaying it onto another of suitable make. The victim can, in their final thoughts, guide the destination of their soul to some degree. Am I correct in assuming that's how you wound up here?
Yeah, Harry said, declining to elaborate any further. F was making it sound like he'd been killed.
This process essentially ends the victim's existence in their source line and injects what remains, the soul, into their same body in another.
Oh.
Think of it like receiving the Dementor's kiss.
Harry jolted at the comparison, and he could feel his heart starting to pound against his ribcage, the blood pumping in his ears.
The body cannot survive without life animating it. In the instant you were bitten by the Ouroboros in your line, your physical body was ruined. There is nothing for you to return to. It is, as I said, impossible.
Holy shit, Harry swallowed thickly. You're telling me that I've... He tried to put the pieces together without looking too closely at the picture they made. I've killed Harry Potter. I've killed myself?
Twice over, in fact.
Twice! It was for the best F had laid down whatever spells she had to give them privacy, else they probably could have heard him shriek down in the dungeons.
Once in your original line, when your soul was severed from your body, and once here, when your consciousness reclaimed its form and overwrote that of the body into which you'd been injected.
Wait, Ron started, suddenly interested. Overwrote his body? You mean this Harry, the Harry from the future, replaced our Harry? F nodded, and Harry thought it was a good thing he was sitting down, or he might have fainted dead away. He'd made a fucking Horcrux, was what he'd done. Of himself. Inadvertently, sure, but he'd still split his soul from his body, committing an atrocity in the doing, and attached it to another. God, he was a fucking Dark Lord now. It cast Draco's wanting anything to do with him in an entirely new light. The queasiness from before redoubled, and Harry really, honestly thought he might vomit. He'd essentially been kissed, and then killed himself, in the span of a heartbeat. And though he felt, aside from his stomach troubles, perfectly all right, the fact of the matter was that this wasn't his body, really wasn't his body. He was trapped in an 18-year-old shell, and he couldn't get back. Oh, fuck. He couldn't get back. I just thought I'd gone to the past. To my past, Harry mumbled weakly, lost. Everything was the same, so many things. I mean, there were little things that were different, but only little things, and I thought maybe I was just misremembering, or I'd changed them on accident.
And indeed, there are probably a great many events in common between this reality and the one from whence you come. Not every choice we make has some grand consequence on the future as a whole.
Harry wasn't really listening anymore. He was thinking, mostly, about Draco. thinking and wondering if maybe Draco hadn't been right all along. Had all these months of effort, been for nothing? Maybe in this line, Draco had never been meant to suffer the kiss at all. Maybe he'd been meant to pick himself up and dust off his knees after graduation and do something worthwhile with his life, all on his own. Maybe all of Harry's meddling had been just that. Meddling. Fucking up Draco's life for no reason other than Harry's own peace of mind. Shit. That meant there was another world out there, his own, still spinning on without him. A world where Draco Malfoy had still gone to the kissing chamber, still been shackled before a Dementor, still had his soul devoured, cold and terrified and alone. A world where Draco Malfoy was, and ever would be, dead. In the end, Harry hadn't managed to save Draco at all. He'd just gotten himself offed in the attempt. Harry? Hermione shook him gently, leaning down to peer into his eyes. Were you listening? Sorry, what? Hermione pointed to F, who had apparently been speaking to him.
As I was saying, I feel it would be best if Aurora Potter accompanied me back to the Ministry, so that my colleagues might speak with him. They'll want to take his statement, perhaps catalogue any events that transpired in his own reality that we might compare them with happenings in our own. This really is a rare opportunity, and if you're amenable to helping, we'll be able to make substantial headway into our research down in time. I'm sure any number of other departments would also appreciate any forewarning you might be able to give them concerning events of import facing Wizarding Britain in the coming years.
He didn't need to be looking at Hermione. He could hear the frown in her voice. But, pardon me, unspeakable F, but is that really wise? I mean, it's one thing to make note of events that have already transpired, for research purposes, but learning about the future?
Potential future, Miss Granger. There's nothing to say anything, good or bad, that has happened in Aurora Potter's home reality will happen in this one as well. But anything he should choose to divulge will be kept in the strictest of confidence and discussed in depth among the greatest minds in the magical community before any action is taken.
Harry doubted this would satisfy Hermione, and truthfully, it didn't really satisfy him either. It was looking like he was going to wind up the Ministry science experiment one way or another, and he was so far beyond caring about contributing to their research at this point, it wasn't even funny. Stuck. He was stuck. And while a part of him hadn't wanted to leave it all, most of him had been, resigned to it. Had been looking forward to getting back, if only to see what ripple effects might be born of the changes he'd made here in the past. He hadn't thought any of this was permanent, at least no more permanent than a memory, and now it was. His new normal, to whatever extent his life had ever been normal. McGonagall cleared her throat softly. Unspeakable Ev, perhaps we could give Aurora Potter the weekend to sort through his thoughts. This must be quite a shock, and if he's been here for 6 months already, then surely your colleagues can delay any questions they may have or studies they hope to conduct for a few more days. F bowed her head politely.
Of course. I shall return to the Ministry and relay my findings to my superiors. We'll send an owl later next week with details on how we hope to work with Aurora Potter going forward, so that we can arrange a schedule for interviews and the like.
Yes, McGonagall said dismissively, then looked to Hermione. Miss Granger, Mr. Weasley, if you could escort Aurora Potter back to Gryffindor Tower for the time being, we'll speak more later, but I think for now it's best he have the day to take this all in. Of course, Professor, Hermione said, moving her steady grip from Harry's shoulder to just under his elbow. With Ron on his other side, the two of them helped Harry to his feet. A good thing, too, as he felt like he'd been hit with a jelly-legs jinx and wasn't certain he could stand on his own without promptly face-planting. They quickly and quietly bore him away down the winding stairs of the headmistress's tower and back out into the third-level corridor. Harry let himself be carried along mutely, his thoughts distant, and it wasn't until they'd reached the fat lady's portrait and practically levitated him into the common room that he finally found his voice. "I'm sorry," he said, though the words sounded so weak, insubstantial, utterly unequal to the remorse he was feeling right about now. "What on earth for?" Hermione asked. "Ron, would you check we've got some privacy? I'll get him comfortable over by the couch." Ron slipped away, perhaps to throw up a few muffliatos, perhaps to menace younger students into finding elsewhere to congregate for the morning, while Hermione shuttled him over to the collection of couches and armchairs next to the darkened fireplace. "Well, I killed your best friend." Hermione gave a sharp intake of breath, but Ron returned to reassure her. "No sweat, I put up the charm. He can confess to as many murders as he likes now. We shouldn't be overheard." "Oh, Harry," Hermione said, rushing to sit beside him. He had his elbows settled on his thighs, back hunched, and she laid a hand along the curve of his spine, rubbing up and down. "You haven't killed anyone." "Were you not listening in there? I have. 2 people. A murder-suicide, if we're being pedantic." "We're nothing if not pedantic," Ron said, taking the cushion to Harry's other side with a loud sigh. "Don't be daft, mate. You haven't—" "I have," Harry said, insistent, because he didn't want to be coddled right now. He'd accepted their help getting back to Gryffindor Tower because he'd been out of sorts and probably would have just found a nice patch of wall to slide down against and sat there on the cold flagstones until his world stopped spinning. But he was rallying now, and he didn't want to be coddled. "I have. I'm not Harry, not your Harry. I don't have his memories, may not even have his personality and preferences." Ron snorted. "That's for damn sure. I mean," he gave Harry a sidelong glance. "Malfoy? When you've got Charlie right there, fit as anything, could make you a lawful Weasley as easily as Jenny could have? Definitely suspect." Harry frowned, pinch-lipped. "I'm serious." "And what makes you think we aren't as well?" Hermione said softly. She left off stroking his back like a child and folded her hands in her lap. "You didn't come here because you wanted to. I did, and you know it. You didn't know the consequences, though. It was an accident. A freak, terrible accident of magic none of us understood, not even your ministry." "Evidently your ministry understands it, though," Harry muttered. "The point is," she continued, taking his shoulder and giving him a little shake, "you absolutely are Harry. Really you are. You're Harry in every reality, and even if you've been misplaced, well, that doesn't make you any less Harry Potter, our very good friend." "Best friend," Ron corrected. "And I don't know about you, but jumping headfirst through time and space to save the life of someone who, let's face facts, really doesn't deserve it, that's about as Harry Potter a move as I've ever heard." Harry appreciated what they were trying to do, really he did, but the fact remained. "You'll never see him again, though. He probably had dreams and hopes and ideas for how he wanted his future to go. Fuck." He ran a hand through his hair. "What if he hadn't broken up with Ginny? What if they just decided to, I don't know, take a sabbatical? He might have wanted to—" Harry shifted around so Ron had to look him in the eye. Don't you miss him?" And Ron's jaw went tight. He cleared his throat, blinking as he shunted his gaze off to the side. "What kind of question is that? Of course I miss him." "Well, you're talking to me like one Harry is as good as another." He wanted them to be angry with him. He wanted them to have stormed out of McGonagall's office, to be silently fuming and refusing to have anything to do with him. He wanted them to hate him for taking their best friend from them, because that was how you were supposed to feel. You weren't supposed to be just a little bit relieved. You weren't supposed to feel like things had worked out maybe for the best. You just weren't. "Do you miss your Ron and Hermione?" Hermione asked, gentle and careful. "You've lost someone important today as well. People we're nothing more than poor replacements for. That's not— We don't have their memories, probably don't have their exact personalities or preferences. We aren't them, and we never will be. And you'll never see them again. So don't you miss them?" "Of course," Harry said, defensive, and it was the truth. Of course he missed them, his Ron and Hermione. A sharp pang lodged deep in his chest, and it suddenly hurt to breathe. He was never going to see them again. He was never going to have his 25th birthday lunch at the Burrow. Mrs. Weasley had sent out invitations a month earlier, and now her Harry was dead. He couldn't even tell her he was sorry, that he had been looking forward to it, that he'd wanted the roast beef and potatoes with glazed carrots and treacle-tart ice cream. God, he'd lost everyone. Except he hadn't. The only reason he wasn't having an actual breakdown now, only a minor mental snap, was because, well, Ron and Hermione were right here, beside him, talking to him and touching him and comforting him, and of course they weren't exactly the same, but they were still Ron and Hermione. He still loved them, and they still loved him. He started, then cleared his throat when his voice caught. I don't want to tell anyone else about this. I think it might get complicated. The Ministry wouldn't want him to go blabbing anyway, if for no other reason than because the magic of the Ouroboros could not be allowed to fall into the clutches of unsavory swords. Would the Neo-Death Eaters rise here, just as they'd done in his own line? He supposed this would be just one of the many matters he'd need to discuss with F and her team in the near future. Hermione nodded, and Ron said, Of course, mate. You've freaked people out enough coming back from the dead. I don't know that they could handle finding out you achieved interdimensional time travel as well. And despite himself, Harry smiled, laughed a little even, a soft, dry chuckle that made the sharp pang in his chest abate just a little bit. Because it wasn't sadness he was feeling. He wasn't sad or angry. It was something more like regret. An odd, distant mourning for everything he'd left behind, and the understanding that people he loved, people he cared about, would miss him, might never understand what had happened to him. They'd think he'd died and not realize he was here, still here, just away, living, still alive. He was here. This was his line now, even if it hadn't been initially. He'd come here because he'd wanted to, and while he wasn't staying because he'd wanted to, it was almost a relief, actually. Not having to disappoint someone one way or the other, not having to choose. He'd hated not being given a choice in his youth, having decisions made without him, being deprived of any manner of agency, but, well, maybe he'd matured. Or maybe he'd finally realized that making decisions yourself meant living with the consequences. He was going to live with the consequences of the last decision he'd made for himself for the rest of his life now. Perhaps he ought to let fate take the reins for a bit,